Chapter 7. Who's Afraid of Defeat? On Monday morning, I begged father to let me off from going to school. Alas for going that week, and he let me. Good man, but he understood. We were two together bearing the brunt of a misconceived marriage. Father started anew. That marriage seemed to have given him a big kick in the pants. Our piece of land did not consist only of bottom lands. There was a 5-acre tract sloping away from it on the other side of the river. It was uncleared as yet, and for father it was time to have it done. Taking his ground axe and cutlass, and I my machete, we went up the slope, hacking away at the vegetation which was matted in places, but sparing in others. Father used the axe. He didn't seem to tire at all. The white chips flew, and the trees cracked, creaked, leaned, and crashed. Every crash sent the birds scattering across the valley, only to regroup, then circle back to the berry-rich trees. We went up the hill, slashing. We spoke but little, two men determined in their silence. Occasionally father would stop to dig into the earth with his fingers, then he'd feel its texture, peer at it, let it trickle through his fingers, smile satisfyingly. And then he would hack again at the bushes and slaughter the trees. With my machete, I cleared the brush away, and by the end of the week we had about 2 acres cleared, and then father set to chopping up the trees, and we got all the waste into neat scattered piles and burnt them. The land, 2 acres of it that is, was ready. What are you planting, father? Yams, Remy. Yams. This is land for yams. Yes, sir. He seemed so sure of himself, but he understood yams, the crop with which he had made his start and with which he intended to begin again. A sensible move. Yams made good business. You could send truckloads of them into the city every week, and they would vanish into the kitchens of the city folk. Yams, father said, and that suited me. Then he began to plow up the soil, fashioning it into yam hills, soon realizing, however, that it was too much work, so he hired 2 men to help him. I returned to school, but even on coming home in the afternoons, I'd find him digging on the hillside, digging shirtless and sweating. The other men were gone. The goats were always my responsibility, but now was added that of Lizette and Marble, and of cooking supper. Father had no time. He worked until dark and came home only to eat supper. He ate in silence, always, and then he would retire to the veranda, where he would smoke his pipe, just sitting there, looking at the night in a mysterious, calculating way, and then he'd go to bed and sleep soundly. I didn't like his silence very much. It was just as though the sun had gone out of this man called Sun, but I knew better than believing that. It had just gone behind a rain cloud. For a time it had to reappear. And the rains came. We had just finished putting in the yams when the showers began to slant in from the hills. It was already May. Father planted corn along the rows of yams. They would not impede the yams. They were a cash crop and would be first out of there. The yams grew out of the ground in stout, purply, sometimes green vines. The corn also grew. Everything grew. Small, kidney-shaped mangoes had reappeared on the trees. The young banana trees that had faded in the drought now took on new life. The trees became greener, and even the wild things which knew no pruning looked healthy. Even Donna Ray was growing. She was taller and fuller, and her eyes looked milkier, and her teeth with them. And oh my, the rich smoothness of her skin was fitting. Around her had begun to appear that thing which I like to name elan. Since goats are the arch enemy of yams, I was forced to put all of mine into ropes. The rains continued, and the rivers changed its colors from soda water purity to copper turbidity, and its voice, trimmed for so many months, resumed its bellicose loudness with the ever-rising volume of water. It looped happily by our bottom land, and sometimes it was just a hand's length beneath Mrs. Hilcher's footbridge. Every now and then I encountered Arline and Brad, but this was the first lengthy walk together that we had since the wedding. They were returning from school as I was, and we walked along together, silent at first, but warming up a bit to a little chit chat. But they were decidedly different. They were colder, and yet I didn't get the impression that they were feeling uppity. Maybe the contrary wedding put them on the defensive in that they may have supposed that I was in a rage about it. But another day when I met Brad alone and offered him some candy, he refused it and went further by truculently brandishing a shilling almost in my face. In it were he tall enough, adding, "I have money, I can buy my own." Sure, he could buy his own. He always could. Anybody could. But they used to take what I offered just the same. Where Arline had left off, Brad had taken up in the matter of touching my soft spot for food, because when we reached the gate of Robin Hill, where again they lived in Hibbertson splendor, Brad said tauntingly, "Guess what we going to have for supper?" Guess. I don't know, Brad, and I don't care. You do so care, he said. You do care for stuffed Cornish hens, don't you? Arline laughed and touched the back of her hair with dainty finesse. You're a fool to stay down in that hole, Brad continued. I bet you're going to have codfish, eh? Go away, I said, stamping my foot. Scram! They were frightened. I had always been gentle with them, and now this. Go, I repeated. They didn't tarry at all. They stepped quickly through the gate, looking back at me every now and then as they hurried up the hill. I went home disgruntled as a bull. And Brad was almost right, because for supper we were to have corned pork, not much better fare than codfish. I could scarcely think that my sister and brother were the types to put on such false airs, but they were doing it. I think they were doing it to win me over, to make me go back and live with them. But how could I? Not now, anyway. Before Ma remarried there was the possibility, but not now. And never at Robin Hill unless it reverted to us. And Ma to Father. Both impossibles. I'd have to stay in River Bottom then. Our yams were a sight to see. Yams grow as vines, and Father had given them huge bamboo sticks of flagpole tallness, and they had twisted themselves to the very tops from which they hung, having nowhere to go, and so channeling their strength into branches and leaves. Now they were feathering nicely. Mangoes were ripening too, cherry pink and peach yellow. They were everywhere, and you smelt them even in the nights. They fell ripe from the trees and lay there waiting to be found and eaten, or else they went floating down in the gutter water to the gorging river. It was corn time. We chopped them down green, almost all of them, because the yams were crowding out the sun from them. What a heap we had! And such large ones among them! We'd sell them in the market next day, but it was Friday night. And who said we couldn't have a corn roast? Which was what we had. Father and Mrs. Hilcher, Donna Ray and me. I mean, we invited them over. What else are neighbors for? We made a good fire in our yard and set the corn, still in their leafy jackets, against the embers, and their leaves smoked away. The fire clicked and cracked in sparkles, and Father and Mrs. Hilcher sat well back, but Donna Ray and I were as close as the heat permitted us. We made fun trying to catch the spiraling, short-lived sparkles, and our teeth flashed in the firelight, and Donna Ray's eyes swam something beautiful. When we thought it was time, we took the corns out and barked their sooty jackets from them, and broke the fire down into glowing coals, and set the naked ears on them to roast. In their jackets they had merely steamed. Now they would have a final head-on confrontation with the fire. and it wasn't long before we began to smell them and, having done so, turn them. Some of their seeds were popping with popgun fierceness, making cauliflower designs, and so we continued to turn them while using a piece of cardboard. Donna Ray fanned back life into the dying coals. The corns lived up to what they looked like. They were juicy and sweet, and somehow, as you ate them, you knew that you were putting in something of worthwhile food value. Donna Ray and I played a game with them. We shelled off so many seeds at a time in our hands, and the idea was your opponent had to guess how many there were. If he lost, she'd have to give me whatever number she had quoted. The next idea was not to lose too many, and the way to accomplish that was to always keep your quotation low. 1, 2, 3, maybe, to be generous, 4, then back down to 1. And if you were real mean, you'd even say none. Of course, we were always eating in between. Because I liked Donna Ray, I made my quotations large. 10, a dozen, 15, even 16 once, until she said I was stupid, jokingly. But just the same, the word stupid has a bad bite to it, and so I started to play it correctly. Father and Mrs. Hilcher ate and talked behind us. They weren't playing any corn games. I thought about them. Was Father in love with her? Was he going to marry her to show Ma? But then show her what? Ma wouldn't even have a hiccup. She'd ask, "And who is Mrs. Hilcher?" Pooh! She'd say something like that. But that was something for Father to know. I think he and the good woman were kindred spirits, which set me thinking further. I wondered if in the old days Father had spooned a bit with her and then dropped her as soon as he had become serious about Ma. Maybe it was something like that too, and jilted Betty had married John Hilcher. But he was dead and gone, and Father was here again. I wondered, and if I were right, what a cold logic life had to it. Ma resigned her job at the school. Not that I minded. It was hard as nails to sit in her classes and look at her, my Ma, but another man's wife. She left at the end of the summer term. Likely or not, Jake didn't care to have his wife work, but to me the real reason was that she was expecting a baby. She looked uncommonly fat. I didn't tell this to Father, but maybe he knew. Such things have a way of finding themselves into a man's eardrums. That hurt, too. Hurt me. This business of a baby. I didn't like to think that Jake's baby was being formed in the same place where I had been formed. It was an outright violation.